Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Identity Theft and Fraud Victimization. What do we know from research and practice? My name is Susan Howley and I am the Program Director for the Center for Victim Research. The center is built through a partnership between researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. This webinar and all of the activities of the Center for Victim Research are supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime, which is part of the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. The center's goal is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge, to increase access to victim research and data, and the utility of research and data collection to victim services nationwide. Today's webinar is designed to address both of those by sharing what we have learned from the evidence around fraud and identity theft victimization and thinking about what that means for victim services. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome our presenters today, researchers Yasemin Irvin-Erickson and Alexandra Ricks, authors of the research synthesis, and victim service provider Hazel Heckers. I'll turn it over to them to let them introduce themselves more fully.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Yasemin Irvin-Erickson, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Criminology at George Mason University. I primarily do research on economic impact of violence and empowerment of vulnerable populations. And I would like to thank you all for joining our webinar today for a very timely discussion on identity theft and fraud. And now, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Alexandra, to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Ricks, and I'm a research analyst at the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center. For the Center for Victim Research, I've been working on the fraud and identity theft synthesis work. I also manage our Research to Practice fellowships, which provide mini-grants to partnerships between victim service providers and practice-engaged researchers. Beyond the CVR work, I am involved in a number of research and evaluation projects seeking to understand how to best serve survivors of crimes and other vulnerable populations. I'm really excited to share some of that work today. And we are very lucky to have one of the top victim advocates in the nation, Hazel Heckers, with us today. I would like to turn it over to Hazel to introduce herself.
Hi, this is Hazel Heckers, and I am a victim advocate with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and I work with identity theft and fraud victims every day, anywhere from the minute that they realize they've been a victim up to 10 or 12 years later when they're still having problems with getting everything resolved. So I'm really honored to be included today, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you have about practice in working with victim advocates. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Today we will begin by giving you a brief summary of the goals of our evidence synthesis on identity theft and fraud victimization, as well as the methods that we use to review research and practice evidence sources. Then we will cover some of the basics, including how identity theft and fraud is defined in the field, and what aspects of identity theft and fraud we focused on in our review of this topic. After that, we will address some key information about the prevalence of identity theft and fraud, as well as the risk factors for victimization. Following that, we will discuss the various types of harms that are associated with identity theft and fraud victimization. And in the latter half of the presentation, we will review the types of services available to victims and where does the field need to grow with regard to research, policy, and practice. Throughout the presentation, Hazel will talk about her professional experience working with and advocating for identity theft and fraud victims. We also reserve time at the end of our webinar to respond to questions and comments from folks in the audience. And needless to say, we are very eager to hear from all of you, so please do submit your questions, comments, and any additional information you would like to share, again, using the chat box throughout the presentation. Our synthesis on identity theft and fraud is the second in a series of evidence synthesis on pressing victimization topics. Our colleagues Sarah Bostomsky and Marina Duane held another webinar on the topic of homicide co-victimization last summer. You can find this webinar and the research brief on this topic on CVR's website and our YouTube channel. The purpose of CVR's evidence synthesis project is to assess the state of the field in crime victimization and victim response in order to help researchers, service providers, and policymakers understand and prioritize what the field needs to do to improve victim services nationwide. Our main objectives in our review include identifying the scale of available evidence on the topic, summarize findings from the best available evidence, and whenever we can, show how the evidence differs across different demographic groups, especially for underserved populations. In order to select and assess appropriate sources of evidence for our synthesis, we developed a framework by drawing from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Evidence Project. The CDC's Evidence Project emphasized the importance of integrating knowledge from the best available research and experiential practice evidence, as well as contextual evidence. With this in mind, for our synthesis on identity theft and fraud, we reviewed and integrated evidence drawn from both research and practice-based sources, while also paying close attention to the context that applies to each piece of evidence. This CDC framework expands our typical understanding of what constitutes evidence and prompts us to think about evidence beyond traditional research articles. And this framework also happens to align well with the mission of Center for Victim Research to bridge the gap between research and practice. As we might all agree, victimization is a very, very complex issue, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And being a researcher for more than a decade myself, I can comfortably say that research studies cannot always capture the full context of program operations or clients' experiences. But practitioners who work on the ground can provide the field the context to understand and respond to complex victimization issues. We wanted to reflect this rich context and incorporate the practice-based evidence as an integral part of our review of evidence on identity theft and fraud. Our primary focus was on reviewing materials available from the years 2000 to present, including research sources like journal articles, as well as practice materials such as reports, fact sheets, briefs, and videos found in research databases and by topic-relevant organizations online. For our synthesis on identity theft and fraud, we ultimately reviewed 160 research articles and 251 practice materials. In synthesizing these materials, we sought to address 5 key questions. First, how many identity theft and fraud victims are there? Second, what are the risk and protective factors for identity fraud and other fraud victimization? Third, what are the harms and consequences that are associated with identity fraud and other fraud victimization? Our fourth question was, what are the key interventions and services available to victims? And finally, what are the policy, practice, and research implications of what we know from the best available research and practice evidence?
All right, so now we want to hear from you again. So if you could, please raise your hand if you or your organization work with victims of identity theft or fraud in any capacity. And you'll see that the raise hand button is to the right, right above your chat function. All right, well, thank you all for participating. It seems like we have a really experienced crowd today, so we hope you all find this useful, and we really look forward to hearing your questions. Feel free to send them throughout the presentation in the chat box, and we'll leave some time at the end to respond.
Thank you. And now that we have given you an overview of our approach, let's turn to the scope of our review. One of the first things we did for our review process was, of course, establish the terminology we would use as well as a definition of identity theft and fraud. Fraud broadly refers to crimes in which deceptive or false acts are committed for personal and typically financial gain. Identity fraud, on the other hand, is a specific subcategory of fraud in which personally identifying information of others such as social security number, birth date, credit card information, is used to commit fraud. Although identity theft and identity fraud are two terms often used interchangeably, there's an increasing attention in the field to differentiate between the two. This is due to the recognition that not all theft of personally identifying information results in fraud, at least not immediately. As you can also see in this figure, identity theft refers to the stealing of identity information through methods such as data breaches or physical stealing of such information. Some examples of identity fraud, on the other hand, include new and existing account fraud, criminal identity theft where a criminal fraudulently uses somebody else's name and other information for citations and arrests, medical identity theft when someone uses somebody else's personal information for fraudulent Medicare or insurance claims, social security number related frauds, or synthetic identity theft where a criminal combines real and fake identity information to create a new identity for fraudulent activities. Some examples of fraud without an identity theft component include prize or sweepstakes scams, Ponzi or pyramid schemes, and sometimes romance scams, although, as you might know, some online romance scams can also have an identity theft component. In our review of evidence on this topic, we search for research and practice evidence on identity fraud and other fraud victims. Similar to Bureau of Justice Statistics' definition of identity theft, the identity evidence we focus on includes either misuse or attempted misuse of personally identifying information for fraudulent purposes. However, considering the increasing call for a distinction between the terms of identity theft and identity fraud, we refer to the instances of identity theft with a fraud component as identity fraud. Although we recognize the importance of it, we did not synthesize evidence on fraud if the fraudulent acts target organizations or the government, if the acts are committed against elderly by trusted individuals, because we have another review that's upcoming, which is going to be focusing on that issue, if the evidence was primarily focused on the prevalence, risk factors, and harms of identity fraud and other fraud for victims in countries other than the U.S., or if the evidence was primarily focused on harms of victimization on businesses and institutions. Looking at the prevalence of fraud victimization, Federal Trade Commission's National Fraud Survey and BJS's National Crime Victimization Survey's Identity Theft Supplement are among the most cited national-level prevalence studies. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, 7% of the U.S. population experienced identity fraud in 2014, and this number climbed up to 10% in 2016. According to the same survey, 19% of the U.S. population experienced identity fraud in their lifetime. And according to the Federal Trade Commission's National Fraud Survey, 9% of the U.S. population fell victim to certain non-identity-related frauds in 2011. According to the 2017 Consumer Reports to the Federal Trade Commission, the most common types of identity fraud were credit card fraud, employment or tax fraud, and utilities fraud. According to the same report, the most common other frauds reported were imposter scams, telephone, mobile service frauds, and prize, sweepstake, and lottery scams. According to Bureau of Justice Statistics 2016 estimates, for 85% of identity theft victims, the most recent incident involved the misuse or attempted misuse of only one type of existing account, such as a credit card or a bank account. In addition to definitional issues around fraud, the amount of time it takes to detect fraud by victims and authorities and underreporting of fraud by victims create challenges against estimating fraud prevalence. Studies show that individuals may be less willing to or able to report fraud if they're ashamed of becoming a victim, if family members were the fraudsters themselves, or if individuals have less control over their finances. Other than complaints to the Federal Trade Commission, the official reporting of identity theft and other fraud to law enforcement agencies is lower than the reporting of victimization for other crime types. For instance, according to the BJS's newly released report on identity theft, only 7% of identity theft victims reported their victimization to police. Just to give you a sense of how this compares to other victimization reporting, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey, in 2017, 45% of violent victimizations and 36% of property victimizations were reported to the police. Hazel, I would like to pause here for a moment. You have extensive experience in providing training to law enforcement in issues in relation to identity theft. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this issue of underreporting of identity theft crimes, and from your knowledge of the field, what is being done by law enforcement agencies to address this issue?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that I want to start out by saying is that law enforcement is not the only place that we should look for why underreporting is occurring, because underreporting occurs partially because victims are informed. Let's say it's a credit card theft or their bank account is compromised. If they contact that financial institution, often they're told reporting to our fraud department is enough, and they're not encouraged to report to law enforcement. And I think that we see that quite frequently happening with identity theft and with scams and frauds. So as far as working with law enforcement, I can tell you what we're doing here in Colorado and what I hear is happening in other departments across the country, and that is that law enforcement agencies are usually doing a really great job of educating detectives and investigators who work on these cases, but maybe not such a good job in educating dispatchers and patrol divisions, and that's who's going to get those initial reports. So I think that we are doing a better job now of including those portions of law enforcement in all of our trainings to make sure that when you call 911 or the non-emergency number, that the dispatcher understands what you're talking about and can get you to a patrol officer to make a report or invite you down to the police department to make a report. But I think it also falls on us as advocates and people who work with victims to first encourage them to report, and second to help them maybe being on the phone with that person while they make the initial report, but also really encouraging them to use language that law enforcement will understand as a crime. Instead of saying things like, well, I think something may have happened to my credit card, saying my credit card was stolen and used, so that it's really clear that a crime is being reported. And I think that would help increase the reporting a lot, as well as just encouraging people to report, even if you've already reported to your financial institution or something like that. But I do think that law enforcement is doing a pretty good job of educating itself and learning a little bit more about how to be more responsive to crime victims. I think we just as advocates who work with those victims need to do a little bit better job of educating them about how to report properly.
Thank you so much, Hazel. Our review of research and practice evidence suggests that while identity fraud and other fraud can affect people of all backgrounds and circumstances, certain traits and circumstances can be related with increased vulnerability to subtypes of these crimes. And looking at the evidence on the relationship between age and victimization risk, younger adults are among the most frequent victims of identity fraud, while older adults are at high risk of other frauds such as fraudulent price promotions. Children, on the other hand, are likely targets for identity fraud because of their clean credit histories and the lower likelihood of detection of such victimization. Looking at the relationship between race and victimization, Latinx and Black people are significantly more likely to experience most common non-identity related frauds. Practice evidence suggests that fraudsters target particular ethnic groups such as Spanish language scams targeting Latinx people or financial scams targeting Native American recipients of publicized legal settlements. Bureau of Justice Statistics' newly released report on identity theft further suggests that persons in households in the highest income category, which should be above $75,000 if I'm not mistaken, had the greatest risk of identity theft in 2016. According to the same report, whites had a greater risk of experiencing existing credit card misuse than non-whites. Evidence further suggests that members of other marginalized groups sometimes become targets. To give you a couple of quick examples, fraudsters may try to exploit undocumented immigrants need to adjust their immigration status. Victims of domestic violence may be at risk of identity fraud by their abusers, using it as a tactic of coercive control. People with cognitive and developmental impairments may be targeted due to perceptions of them as being more vulnerable. Groups that are unable to monitor financial information, like military personnel or incarcerated people, may be prone to identity fraud victimization. And results from Federal Trade Commission's 2011 fraud survey further show that people who are risk takers, people with low patience, people with limited numerical skills, and consumers who have excessive debt in comparison to their income level are more likely to be victims of fraud categories included in this particular survey. And here again, Hazel, I would like to turn to you for your insight into this issue. You work with a number of populations that research shows are targeted for identity theft and fraud, older adults, immigrants, and people with disabilities. From your experience, why do you think these groups of people are especially vulnerable to fraud?
Well, I think that one thing is that we need to realize that some of the statistical information may be a little bit skewed because it's who reports, not necessarily who's victimized. So just to remember that sometimes there are many people who are victims of these crimes who are just not reporting. And if the information isn't getting reported to the FTC or to a law enforcement agency or to another resource that collects this data, they may not be counted in these numbers. And I think that that's one of the perfect examples of that would be people who are immigrants in this country. I know that we had a big scam going on here in Colorado, and I understand it was happening across the nation, where people were being targeted if they were from a certain country. Here in Colorado, it was from China, and they were receiving calls from someone claiming to be with the Chinese consulate and letting them know that their green card or their citizenship to the U.S. would be canceled unless they paid a large sum of money, usually $20,000 or more, to get that information sent back in again. And they certainly use current politics and make reference to that as a way of saying, and this is why you're being called by this. So it gives it a little bit of authority. And so I think that some of it is that people who are new to this country may not know as much about the way that immigration works, the way that citizenship works, and so may fall victim a little bit more easily to someone claiming that there is a problem and that you can pay your way out of it. I think with older adults, that what we see them being much more vulnerable to are some of the scams that really play on their fear level, talking about their Medicare benefits being canceled or their Social Security benefits being canceled. And some of that is just education, that we really need to do a better job as a country in educating older adults who may not be out in the community as much hearing about this, or may not be on social media. So doing more public service announcements on TV or something more in print media. And I think the same thing happens in our community, in the rural communities, where a lot of that information isn't getting out through, especially to older populations, isn't getting out through social media or community gatherings, and really needs to be focused a little bit more on how we can reach people who are not part of those communities.
This is wonderful insight again. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Yasmin and Hazel. I'm now going to give an overview of 4 main buckets of harms and consequences that fraud victims can face. And of course, there are other harms, and not all of these impact all victims equally, but these are some of the main ones that we found in our review. So the 4 buckets are economic or financial harms, health harms, social harms, and legal consequences. I'm going to start with economic harms. These are probably the harms or consequences that come to mind first when one hears fraud. There are both direct and indirect economic harms I'm going to talk through. To begin, direct economic harms include the actual loss of money or other things of value from fraud or identity theft victimization. In 2017, the most common non-identity fraud type was imposter scams, That's where a fraudster pretends to be someone else, from a loved one to an IRS agent, or the scam that Hazel just mentioned, in order to trick the victim out of money. In 2017, the average victim of an imposter scam lost $500. That's a direct economic harm. Another example of a direct economic harm could be losing the equity of property. This might affect victims of housing-related scams. One example of this is a foreclosure rescue scam, where someone behind on their mortgage is promised help for money, which never arrives, and they lose their home. Another type of scam involves the victim being tricked into signing over the deed to their home. Victims of these types of fraud can lose the equity of their homes as a result of their victimization. Indirect financial consequences, on the other hand, include lost economic opportunity in the future. The prime example of this is when a victim of identity fraud has a damaged credit score as a result of their victimization. For example, the fraudster will take out loans or open a new credit account in the victim's name, usually without their knowledge, and unsurprisingly, they don't pay the bill. This damages the victim's credit score. And as we know, credit scores are used for everything these days. So a victim could be prevented from getting a new loan or utility account, from passing a background check for an apartment, or even passing a background check for a new job. All of those can affect finances in an indirect way. It's also important to note that research shows us that financial consequences can last for a long time. Many of us have been victims of existing account fraud. Someone uses your credit card, the bank calls, and then they wipe the charges. But that's not everyone's experience. Especially for victims of more complex types of fraud, resolving the financial harms can take more than 6 months for a small number of victims. This means that it's really important for service providers to plan for long-term follow-up with those complicated cases. Next, I'm going to discuss health harms. These came up frequently in our searches of both research and practice evidence. So fraud victimization can affect emotional and mental well-being as well as physical health. First, there is evidence of strong emotional responses as a result of fraud victimization. That can include loss of trust, paranoia, and extreme stress. Researchers even coined the term fraud trauma syndrome to describe this experience. And practice evidence emphasizes that emotional responses to fraud victimization might not be dissimilar from those of victims of violent crimes. As a result of all of this emotional stress and other mental health challenges, victims can experience physical health symptoms as well, like trouble sleeping, headaches, and fatigue. In particular, I'd also like to highlight the physical health consequences experienced by victims of medical identity theft. Medical identity theft is when a victim's information is used by someone else seeking health services. As a result, the victim may end up with wrong information in their health record, such as blood type or medical allergies. In the worst cases, this can result in misdiagnosis or mistreatment, especially in an emergency situation. This is a prime example of the physical health harms that may be experienced by some identity fraud victims. I'll wrap up this discussion of harms with a quick note on the potential social and legal consequences of fraud victimization. First, victims can, in some specific circumstances, face either civil or legal troubles. This could include civil suits as a result of a large debt, for example. Criminal consequences are usually the result of criminal identity theft victimization. Criminal identity theft happens when an imposter uses a victim's name when they're arrested or apprehended by law enforcement. Then, they might miss a scheduled court date, which will result in a warrant being issued in the victim's name. This can then result in a false arrest or even an erroneous criminal record for the victim. In both of these situations, a victim might require legal services. And finally, as a result of all the harms I've described, from legal troubles, financial troubles, to stress, victims can have social or reputational damage. Relationships can be strained, and word can get out about their problems, which is an additional burden to victims. At this point, we're going to talk about how the field is trying to prevent victimization and remedy the harms I just mentioned. Yasemin and I will give an overview, and then Hazel will weigh in on some of her experiences.
Thank you, Alexandra. Our review of evidence on fraud victimization revealed that services directed towards identity fraud and other fraud victims are limited, and those that exist usually focus on repairing financial damages for identity fraud victims. Services to address the legal, emotional, and physical health needs of identity fraud victims are rarer. And I'm very happy Hazel brought up the issue of outreach efforts. Addressing identity fraud and other fraud victimization most often comes in the form of educational and outreach efforts about protecting oneself from, recognizing the signs of, and reporting the crime. Various national and state-based fraud, either identity or non-identity related hotlines exist to educate the public, provide an outlet for reporting, give victims advice on recovery, and connect them to services. Preventive educational programs and peer outreach are among the few programs that have been evaluated. Evaluations of these programs have shown improvements in secure online behaviors and decreased vulnerability to fraud victimization. Outreach efforts targeting underserved populations, such as non-English speakers or older adults, have been highlighted as important by practitioners.
So, reiterating what Yasemin said, we found that the majority of intervention services were focused on a couple of specific areas. So, for one, they are usually oriented towards the needs of identity fraud victims rather than victims of other types of fraud. Second, they usually focus on the needs of victims of financial identity frauds rather than things like medical or criminal identity theft. And lastly, they focus pretty much exclusively on remediating the financial harms rather than emotional stress or potential legal needs. So I'll go over just a couple examples of the services that are focused on the financial harms of financial identity frauds. First is identity theft insurance, which is usually provided by private service providers and can cover the costs of remediation of financial harms, things like lost wages from time spent on the phone or notary fees. Some others are credit monitoring and identity monitoring, which are services where a third party watches for suspicious behavior related to a potential victim's personally identifying information. For credit monitoring, they're looking specifically for new accounts opened in the victim's name. For identity monitoring, they're looking for personally identifying information in places it shouldn't be, like the dark web. As a note, these are just alerts, and after finding out, a victim would need to take steps or seek additional help to actually address the harm. The last I'll discuss is identity restoration assistance. This is the hands-on help that a victim could seek if they found out they are a victim of identity fraud. This type of help includes hands-on support from a provider to take the steps needed towards financial recovery. That includes calling creditors and financial institutions, reaching out to credit reporting agencies, contacting law enforcement and the Federal Trade Commission to report, and any other supports. Notably, hands-on identity restoration assistance can be expensive if it's a paid service, and it's time-consuming to provide. However, this help is really important for people who have complicated cases, including non-financial identity frauds, or people who have challenges communicating with the required entities. This could include child victims, people with cognitive impairments, people with limited English proficiency, or others. Victims who have simpler cases and are able can often help themselves recover from the financial harms with detailed self-help materials. Organizations can often provide those at a lower cost. Now, I have a question for Hazel. Can you talk for a couple minutes about the services that you and your organization provide to identity theft and fraud victims, and which services do you feel are the most impactful?
Sure. Well, we provide what we like to refer to as comprehensive services for victims of identity theft and fraud. And so that starts with a 24-hour hotline that's available 365 days a year, where the advocates who answer that hotline are specialists in identity theft and fraud. So they do know how to answer those questions when you're arrested at 2 o'clock in the morning, or you're one of those people who's up all night and just happens to check your credit card at 4 in the morning, or something happens on a holiday. And then once somebody gets to our victim advocates, it's our goal to determine the extent of the identity theft. So to do a really thorough background. If they say that they're aware of financial identity theft or medical identity theft, chances are that they're a victim of multiple forms. And so we really like to do a complete and thorough background check and determine how extensive the identity theft is. And then we put together a plan to help that person out, whether it is helping them correct their credit history, getting fraudulent accounts closed and resolving financial issues, or if it's something a little bit more complicated, like helping them with their medical histories and getting that corrected and getting their medical records flagged so that this doesn't continue to happen to them, working with departments of labor if somebody is using their Social Security number for work and it's impacting their ability to receive benefits or their tax refunds or something like that, kind of working through that with them, working with the IRS and the Social Security Administration to get that resolved. And then a lot of our work is done regarding the people who are victims of criminal identity theft. That's one of those areas where it is close to impossible for a victim to repair that on their own. And many of those monitoring services that offer assistance don't really understand the criminal justice system's court process. They understand how to do it in civil courts, but not necessarily how to work in the criminal justice system to get those issues removed from your criminal history, not just sealed or dismissed or expunged, but to actually get them removed in a way that identifies you as a victim of identity theft so that when the identity thief does it again, you don't have to start all over. So we really do as comprehensive a service as we possibly can for victims. And similarly with victims of scams and frauds, if we catch it early enough, and then we can do our best to get any wired money back. If, unfortunately, they sent cash or gift cards or something like that, that's, impossible for us to correct, but we can certainly work with those victims around not being victimized again, not allowing that current scam to continue, learning ways to prevent it in the future, and then also connecting with other victim assistance programs for financial assistance and any other kind of support that they might need to get to kind of get restored a little bit for that. So, and we really discourage any victim, no matter how tempting it might be, to try to access the dark web to find out if their information is on there. The dark web is a dangerous place, and people should not be on it unless unless they're law enforcement professionals and know what they're doing. So we really, really discourage that. So we pretty much offer the victims the wide range. We also do a lot of proactive work to see how we can prevent people from being victims in the future, as well as doing a lot of outreach and training through social media, as well as in-person presentations to talk to people about ways to protect themselves and ways to avoid being victims in the first place. And so we're hoping that we're getting people from both ends, both the people who've already been victims and the people who might be victims in the future, and hopefully we can stop some of that.
Thank you for sharing, Hazel. I have to say what you all are doing is really a phenomenal model for the field. So this is why we're so glad to have you today. So as a follow-up to that, I'll just wrap up our discussion of services. So as I mentioned before, the services that I was discussing were mostly for victims of financial identity fraud. And as Hazel noted, some providers aren't necessarily well equipped to help victims of other types of frauds. And so I'll just say that our review really pointed to the fact that the field is in need of additional services for victims of non-identity related frauds, like a romance scam or a foreclosure rescue scam, and also for non-financial identity frauds like medical or criminal identity theft. Further, civil legal services are an important service for many people who are facing debt or civil suits. And unfortunately, many states do not have legislation that makes the attorney's fees recoverable for fraud cases, so private attorneys are not always incentivized to take those cases on. As a result, civil legal services for fraud victims are usually provided by legal service and pro bono providers that are often already overloaded. Lastly, the field is in need of more mental health services and mental health specialists that are familiar with the experiences and needs of fraud victims. So this will bring us to our final section, and I will let Yasemin start our wrap-up with an overview of where the field needs to grow.
Thank you so much again. Most research on identity fraud and other fraud focuses on risk factors, prevalence as we discussed, and economic outcomes of fraud victimization. The victim services field needs more research on these important topics, and in particular, reasons for non-reporting by individuals who know they have been victims of fraud, state level and regional trends in fraud victimization, emerging types of fraud such as synthetic identity theft, online auction frauds, and frauds in disaster regions, unfortunately, and non-financial harms of identity fraud and other fraud, and additional information about the impacts of education programs on victimization, re-victimization, and secure behavior. And as Hazel was talking about it, and right before starting the webinar, I was like today going over ITRC's wonderful study, the aftermath study. I think we also need more studies about the longitudinal or the long-term impacts of this victimization on individuals, because you might be clearing the records, you might be clearing certain instances, but the impacts continue for a longer period of time. And last but not least, there's still this need in the field for getting into an agreement about how to operationalize and define identity theft and fraud, and especially for identity theft, breaking down identity theft into smaller components to better capture and provide responses to different stages of identity theft.
And in terms of policy and practice, overall our review of both practice and research evidence suggested that the field needs to be able to respond to the many varied experiences of fraud victims that we have discussed today. There are many different fraud types, and their victims all have distinct needs. Those need to be incorporated into preventive and interventive services. So as a final question for Hazel on this topic, I'm hoping you could weigh in as well. So from your experience, where does the victim services field need to grow to best serve and connect with victims of fraud and identity theft?
Well, I think the biggest issue is not having services at all. And as far as the victim assistance field, it's often very difficult to find a victim advocate in a local law enforcement agency or a district attorney's office who knows about identity theft and fraud and who works with those victims. A lot of times the services are provided for victims of personal crimes, such as sex assaults, homicides, domestic violence, but not for victims of what's considered a property crime, or which identity theft, unfortunately, is still, and fraud are still in that category. So there just aren't resources in every state for people who are victims of crime to turn to. And for us as victim service providers, it's very difficult when we come on a state where we cannot find a single victim service provider who's aware of this issue and who's able to work with them in that state. And so I think that's probably where I would say the biggest need is. Certainly some advocacy around including victims of identity theft and fraud in the state's Victims' Rights Amendment and allowing them to access resources through victims' compensation. Those are certainly things that I would encourage people to advocate for if they already have that victim service in their community. And I think that just educating the victim service providers about the emotional harm, because I know it's easy to say, well, you got that fixed, so why are you still upset? And that's not something that we would ever say to a victim of a violent crime, but it is something that gets said frequently to victims of identity theft and fraud. And so I think that it's important to educate the victim assistance community as well about the emotional impacts and the psychological impacts of these crimes and the fact that they can pop up anytime. You know, if your home gets broken into and your TV gets stolen, your TV gets stolen and it's gone and somebody pawns it and it's sold and it's done. But if your identity gets stolen, it can be stolen over and over and over and over again, and you may go for 5 or 6 years with no impact, and then suddenly it's being used again. So it's a crime that you never know when it will sneak up and when it will hit you again. And that has a huge impact on victims, not knowing when they can be safe. So I think all of those are areas that as victim service providers, we really need to put some focus, and possibly having more therapists and who are willing to do support groups for fraud victims, or who understand that long-term impact of identity theft and fraud.
Hazel, thank you so much. And I want to leave enough time for the questions from our audience as well. But right before that, I promise this is our last question for you. Being a researcher myself, I have to ask this. What other questions would you have liked to see answered by researchers on this topic?
Well, that is a big question. I think that what I would like to see is maybe a little bit more information about those kinds of crimes that aren't as publicized and aren't as popular in the kind of vernacular about identity theft and fraud, because we certainly see LifeLock and companies like that doing a lot of education around financial abuse, but we don't see criminal identity theft being mentioned very often. Medical identity theft, certainly not. And I think that we also shy away from talking about someone who's using another person's social security number for work and the impact that that has on their life. So I would like to see those included, the impacts of those crimes and the frequency of those crimes included a little bit more. And then maybe just who is not reporting, because I think that what our research and statistics tell us is who is reporting, but that doesn't tell us who's being a victim who's not reporting. And I don't know how you research that, which is why I'm not a researcher, but I think that if it would be possible to find out who's not reporting but is being victimized, then we could do a lot of targeting in terms of outreach and education to those communities to make sure that everyone gets to come to the table and get their chance at the criminal justice system.
Yeah, all very fair points. Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you. And I would like to turn it to Susan just to make sure we can get the questions from our audience as well. Susan?
Great. So everyone, remember that chat box down below. Please enter your questions for the audience at this time. We did have one question come in already, and that is, should we be pressuring the credit card companies or presumably others who suffer a data breach to include mental health services for their customers who are victims of fraud?
This is a very, very interesting and important question. And in fact, one of the reasons, if you can remember at the beginning of the webinar, we were talking about this importance about the distinguishing between different stages of identity theft and, between identity theft and identity fraud. And we really believe in the premise that if we can pay specific attention to this and the different stages of the acquisition of identity information and then the use of identity information to commit fraud and other outcomes of identity theft, we might be able to shift that shift that responsibility a bit more to the business side of this victimization incident. So, and I would like to also give Hazel an opportunity here to reflect on this question as well.
Well, I don't know how far we would get trying to pressure credit card companies to include mental health services. I think that most of the credit card companies aren't focused on restoration as much as they are just removing the fraudulent charges and getting you a new credit card. So I don't really know how successful we would be in doing that, but I do think that pressure needs to be put on the businesses who have data breaches so that they can be a little bit more responsible for educating their community in advance about what they do to protect their identities and to protect their information, and then taking responsibility when that doesn't happen, and to offer, in that case, to offer more support in restoring that person's identity and in restoring their mental health as well.
Great. We've had some more questions come in, but I am going to ask Jason to go ahead and post the poll now, and that'll remain open for the remainder of our time here. But a question has come in for Hazel specifically. Hazel, can you give us a little bit more information about what is involved in repairing the harm from criminal identity fraud?
Sure. There's two forms of criminal identity theft, and one of them is, and I just have to say about the naming conventions, most law enforcement agencies and most victims will use the term identity theft and not identity fraud. And so I think that it's helpful. I know from a research perspective you have to differentiate between them, but from just a practical standpoint, most people will call it identity theft. And so there's two portions of that. One is if the crime occurs and is placed on your criminal history. So if it's a felony, misdemeanor, something that requires it to be reported to a person's criminal history. And then the other is if it's not a criminal history related crime, such as a traffic incident or a municipal or city crime. And in those cases, it varies drastically in both those cases, drastically varies from state to state. But the basic process for getting something removed from your criminal history is to get a criminal history background check, determine how many states that person has committed crimes in your name and then getting a records challenge process begun. Usually records challenges require fingerprints and photographs to be taken, and that is often done at the victim's expense. So the victim will need to pay anywhere from a couple dollars to $25 or $50 to get their fingerprints done. And then it's sent to that state's agency, and again, that varies drastically. It's sent to that state's agency that handles their criminal history records, and then that criminal history can be corrected and marked. So we got very frustrated with this at CBI because our process is really easy and we do our best to have it be a no-cost prospect for victims, but a lot of other states it's very, very difficult. So for us, they just call me or one of my advocates, and we get everything else resolved for them and get their fingerprints done and get that resolved and get them a letter that says that they're not that person, that their record is cleared, and we give them a special number for background checks that will not show any of those crimes. But other states are very complex and some have high fees to correct it. So we contacted all 50 states and the District of Columbia as well, and found out what their process is, who to contact, how much it costs, what the paperwork is, and we've posted that on our website so that if you don't live in Colorado and you would like information about how that's corrected in your state, you can just click on the map on your state, and if you're not dexterous and you're in one of those teeny tiny little states back east, you can just click on the name of your state, and then you can find out that information. And our website is pretty easy to find. It's colorado.gov /CBI. And then you would just go down to the identity theft portion of that and click on the interactive map. And that'll help you figure that out. And then certainly for the DMV and for other crimes, it's a matter of going to those individual courts or those individual police departments issuing the traffic ticket and getting things resolved at that level, and then going to district court and requesting an order of factual innocence that can then be turned in to correct it. So it's a very complex and lengthy process and very daunting for victims. And if it's not done through someone like a law enforcement agency or district attorney's office, there are a lot of filing fees, and it can be quite expensive as well.
Wow, that is really complex and burdensome for victims. Thank you, Hazel.
Sure.
We had another question. Why isn't there a single source for victims to go to report cybercrimes? Or researchers, have you uncovered any organization that's working to do this?
Yeah, and I can, to my, I'm right now with my co-PIB LEDMs, we are involved in, we developed and piloted a survey on cybercrime with State Attorney General Office, so I'm kind of familiar with the topic. And cybercrime is basically any crime, almost all crimes can have a cyber component, so the complaints about cybercrime might be captured by different organizations. And one thing from the top of my head I can say, I mean, most of the cybercrime complaints might be going to either FTC, there's one particular organization, IC3, Internet Crimes Complaint Center, might be getting that, fraud.org can be getting it, even ITRC might be getting it as a part of the complaints to these centers. So because of the complexity of this issue, how, any type of crime from theft to, if you are talking about cyber exploitation, it can be captured by very different organizations. But if you're talking about one center organization, my biggest guess would be IC3 might be a place to look at.
Thank you. We have one more question posted, although, folks, we can continue for a few more minutes. If anyone out there has additional questions, go ahead and enter them in the chat box. Here's a question. Has financial therapy or financial counseling been considered to meet both the financial and mental health needs of victims?
I mean, any one of us can jump in, but from my review of research evidence, I didn't run into studies that are evaluating that. Alexandra and Hazel.
What I would say just from the practical standpoint is that after the fact, things like financial counseling and financial support may be helpful, but these are victims who don't often know who's perpetrating against them. And they can be doing everything right. They can have financial planners. They can be protecting themselves in every way possible and doing everything that they possibly can correctly. And they can still be a victim of identity theft, whether it's financial or other identity theft. I mean, certainly, if we didn't learn anything from the Equifax data breach, we did learn that anybody can be a victim at any time. And there's nothing that being financially well would have done to prevent people from being victims of something like an Equifax data breach or the IRS data breach when that occurred or something like that. So I think it's a great resource, and I think it certainly should be considered as part of what's done to support victims, but I don't think it's going to prevent that much victimization. Some things like encouraging people to freeze their credit and to monitor their accounts are certainly things that can be helpful in reducing the risk, but I don't know that it's not a 100% success. It's certainly nothing I would ever discourage, though. I think the more financially aware people are in advance, the less likely they are to have the longer-term effects, because they will catch any victimization sooner, and they'll have the resources at their fingertips to correct it, where they might not if they've never thought about their financial wellness before. I don't know if that answered the question for that person or not.
Well, thank you. We had another question. What organizations work directly with victims of identity theft and other forms of fraud? If you know, and otherwise we will try to include some links to resources when we post the recording of this webinar and other materials. But if any of our presenters today know what organizations work directly with victims.
I think it depends on how we define the tasks involved with regard to complaints. Again, FTC, IC3, fraud.org, ITRC, these are all the organizations I can think about, and other organizations, if you are talking about services that you can you add, Alexandra?
I think that it varies a lot by state, but I believe there is a directory available on the Office for Victims of Crime's website, which is something that we could include as a resource after the webinar.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. that is a great resource to get information, and I do encourage people to think about some of the nationwide programs like the Identity Theft Resource Center. They've got some great materials. And when the government's back up and working again, the identitytheft.gov page from the FTC is very helpful, though I don't know how, again, I agree with Yasemin, it depends on how you define direct services. And then certainly in Colorado, we do here at CBI.
Great. I think I have time for one more question, and that is, how could we best assist spouses or beneficiaries when their Social Security numbers get compromised? I know that's a very specific question, and I'm not, if any of you feel able to address that, go ahead. Otherwise, we can try to look for materials and post it when we post the recording.
And I assume that you mean, how do you assist a spouse if their spouse's Social Security number is compromised, to make sure theirs is not as well, as opposed to in a domestic violence relationship? If that could just be clarified.
All right, we'll see if that person is able to clarify. The way the question reads right now, it could be either.
So domestic violence is certainly a whole other field, but certainly if you have joint accounts, if you own a house together, if you have ever filed taxes together, if one person in a couple is compromised, the other person needs to assume they will be as well. And so they would just follow all of the same protective pieces that the person who is the victim would follow. In cases of domestic violence, I think it's really important to work with your local domestic violence shelter or services and with local law enforcement if you've reported the crime to the police, and to make sure that you're getting all of your safety needs met first. And then focus on knowing that your spouse already knows everything. Your abusive spouse knows everything. They have your Social Security number. They have your date of birth. They know those other things about you and your children. And putting some protections in place to make sure that that is taken care of. And I believe that the domestic violence field is one field where the advocates and police officers working in those fields are very well educated about how identity theft can impact a victim of identity theft, and will probably have, or a victim of domestic violence will have a lot of resources available. The military also, I believe that's a huge area where spouse's information is compromised, but that person cannot do anything about it because they're deployed, and the military has some wonderful resources and assistance. So if it's a spouse of a military member who's currently deployed, I would definitely encourage them to contact whatever branch of the military that person is in, talk to them about what resources they have available, because they have done a spectacular job of getting some really qualified advocates to help out.
Great, thank you. We did have some clarification. They were talking about if a spouse is deceased. And another commentator noted that it's important to educate people that you can still have identity theft after a person has passed away.
It's very common to have identity theft after a person has passed away. So I think that if your spouse passes away, there's a couple of things that people need to do right away. If there's an executor of the will, or the estate, that person needs to get engaged as quickly as possible to notify credit reporting agencies, financial institutions, and Social Security Administration, IRS, that person is deceased. And they need to do that with official death certificates from the health department, so, or vital statistics, or wherever your state gets those death certificates. And then there are a lot of follow-up steps, but I don't think we really have time to go over those. So I think it's really important, if you don't have an executor or an attorney who's helping you after a spouse passes away, to talk to an educated victim advocate about ways that you can protect your identity and protect your deceased spouse's identity, and not just your spouse. If you have an underage child who passes away as well, you definitely want to make sure that you take care of that. If your if you know someone whose family member is a victim of homicide, they also are at high risk.
Well, I want to thank all of our presenters today. You all have done a wonderful job. I want to remind participants that we will be posting resources along with this recording. We will include information about the Identity Theft Resource Center's call center and their website and other practical resources to serve victims, as well as additional information on the research. Remember that the CVR's evidence synthesis on this topic will be posted in written form too, and when that comes out, we will be sure to send you all a link. So with that, we are a little bit past our time. I want to again thank our presenters, Yasemin, Alexandra, and Hazel. This has been fascinating. I feel as though there's a lot more that we could talk about, but this has given people a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.